everyone, and welcome to a conversation about the future of White House regulatory oversight in the new Biden administration. I'm Adam White, director of Scalia Law School's Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. It's my pleasure to welcome you and our featured speakers to today's discussion. This is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to be hosting over the next several weeks to consider various aspects of regulatory policy in the Biden administration. I'll say a little more about the series at the end of today's event, but let's move right away to the subject of today's discussion. For 4 decades, White House regulatory oversight has been a central mechanism of public administration. The Reagan administration, drawing from its predecessor's experience, first instituted the modern framework for the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, in 1981, and subsequent administrations have largely maintained that framework, though with reforms and refinements along the way, especially President Clinton's Executive Order 12866. So what should we expect from the Biden administration, both in reforming or repealing the Trump administration's own reforms, or in making new reforms of its own? To discuss these questions and more, it's my pleasure to introduce 3 scholars who have written incisively about public administration, cost-benefit analysis, and White House regulatory oversight. We've posted their biographies on our webpage for this event, so here I'll just briefly say a few words. Michael Livermore is a professor of law at the University of Virginia. Before that, he was the founding director of NYU's Institute for Policy Integrity, and he's the co-author of the new book that I'm sure we'll be discussing. Jennifer No is a professor of law at the University of Chicago, and before that, she served in OIRA as a policy analyst, special assistant to Administrator Cass Sunstein. Stuart Shapiro is a professor and associate dean of faculty at Rutgers University's Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy. From 1998 to 2003, he also served in OIRA as a policy analyst. Now, welcome everyone, and let's start with a broad question. As we look ahead to President Biden's oversight of administrative agencies, what do you see as the most important issues or challenges awaiting the new administration? We'll start with Mike.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Adam, and thanks for pulling this together, and to the Gray Center for hosting this important conversation. Looking forward to chatting with you all. So, very, very quickly, because there's obviously a lot of terrain to cover. I kind of bucket the challenges that the Biden administration will face, or what I see as the agenda before the Biden administration, into 3 general categories. One is to undo or reverse the harmful practices regarding regulatory review, but really kind of specifically with respect to cost-benefit analysis and the practice of cost-benefit analysis that we've seen over the last 4 years. And happy to talk in more detail about what some of those might be and so on. But that's kind of agenda item number 1, is to reverse a mistaken direction of the prior administration. A second broad category I see before this administration is to update cost-benefit analysis techniques in important ways. So just to give one example, the circular A4, its friends call it the A4 circular, but I think it's officially the circular A4 is the guidance document that describes how agencies should conduct cost-benefit analysis. It was adopted in the early years of the George W. Bush administration. So it's a very important document. There's lots of good stuff in there, but many of these methodologies have been improved over the years. There have been new insights by scholars and practitioners. And so working to ensure that agencies are using the most updated techniques, I think, is another important agenda item for this administration. And then the third bucket is this a broad list of important new directions or important innovations for this administration, not just kind of updating the way things are done, but maybe there are important innovations. And so 2 that are perennial topics of conversation in the administrative state are retrospective review and program evaluation, and then distributional analysis. And there's many, many things to say about both of those topics. And so really, I'm just kind of putting them on the table as 2 examples of areas where this administration might want to push the ball forward in important ways. So those is kind of a conceptual ordering, I think, of a very full plate for this administration to get started with.
Thanks, Mike. And let me just add, I alluded to his new book. I'll just point out that it's recently released. He co-authored it with Richard Revesz of NYU. And the book is titled Reviving Rationality, Saving Cost-Benefit Analysis for the Sake of the Environment and Our Health. Just a few weeks ago, I did a podcast with Mike and Professor Revesz. And so if you want to learn more about the book, you're practically on a book tour these days, Mike. So it's not hard to find him, but do check out our podcast. Maybe next on this broad question of setting the table, we'll turn to Stuart. Stuart, what's awaiting the next administration?
So in terms of regulatory review, I think I agree with everything Mike said, but I think I'd characterize the biggest task as a more amorphous one, and that is sort of restoring faith in both the ideas of executive review and of cost-benefit analysis of regulations. Now, there's some people that will never agree with either of these concepts or these roles for OIRA, and they've had a good 4 years because many of their criticisms have been borne out by the actions of the Trump administration. And I think both of these ideas have taken some real blows to the idea of executive review and to cost-benefit analysis. I'll give a quick example in terms of the quality of regulatory impact analyses. I teach cost-benefit analysis. I do it every spring, and I was recently doing my syllabus, and we end the semester with several case studies, which the students examine and try to find fault with or praise or whatever. And I have never had as hard a time as I did this semester in finding RIAs done by the Trump administration that were meaty enough and substantive enough for them to actually learn something from looking at. And I think that has become the norm over the past 4 years. Of course, there's a bunch of new initiatives. Mike talked about reversals, 13771, the Clean Air Act rule on using cost-benefit analysis, and the sunset rule at HHS. I actually think these are the easy things to reverse, these sort of headline type items between the executive orders, which can be reversed quickly, and the regulations, which may take more time, but may not, depending on their legal status in the Congressional Review Act. But rebuilding cost-benefit analysis and the reputation of OIRA is going to take longer and may indeed be a project that'll span the length of the Biden administration.
Thanks, Stuart. I think we'll probably circle back to that in just a few moments. But Jennifer, what awaits the new administration?
Yeah, so I think Stuart and Mike have already identified many of the most pressing issues. And in looking over my notes, I realized that the few others I would offer conveniently start with P's. So they're the 3 P's. So the first is, I think, there's just a lot of these exigent circumstances that I think the Biden administration is going to be dealing with, okay, related to the pandemic. And I think that as a result, confronting these exigent circumstances with the regulatory state is going to require a turning of the ship of state during this transition that is going to raise questions about kind of the staffing of OIRA. And of course, I mean really at the top of the administrator. And, if you look at the previous presidential administrations, even with friendly aligned Senates, it took I think about 9 months for the first OIRA administrator to be confirmed. I think it was 7 months or so for Rao to be confirmed in the Trump administration. So even under the best of circumstances, there's been a lag of the political appointee at the top. And I think one pressing issue is getting that administrator confirmed as soon as possible so that somebody with that accountability and the imprimatur of Senate confirmation can really start to act and push the agenda forward of the Biden administration. The second is, I think there's going to be a real push to get different groups involved and participation in the OIRA process, groups that haven't, certainly in the last administration, been a part of that process. And I think there's going to be a lot of creative thinking, both inside and outside of OIRA, to how to make OIRA more open to the public in this way, whether that's, marshaling Zoom and, remote meetings to make these 12.866 meetings by which, a lot of these participants can meet when OIRA is considering a rule. Of course, there's mixed empirical evidence, really more evidence that they're not that effective in practice, but at least maybe reducing the barriers of participation can start to get some of these groups involved. I think that there was some pushback on some of those ideas earlier, but maybe this is really the time to open OIRA up in that way. Finally, perhaps least interestingly, but it is certainly part of OIRA that many people talk about, if only because they deal with it every day, is the Paperwork Reduction Act. I think that especially in COVID times, there's going to be a lot of push to get information both from the public. So for more generalists in the room, right, as you may have heard, right, the PRA basically has a bunch of requirements for the federal collection of information, including various notice and comment periods. And, in COVID times, there are a lot of statutory authorities that have been invoked because it's a public health emergency to waive some of these PRA requirements. But, as Stuart has written on and Stuart Wells knows as well, there are many other ways that OIRA can fast track and, not stand in the way at all of these collections of information to see whether the efforts that are being undertaken to confront these exigencies are really working or not.
Well, thanks everybody. I should have noted at the outset for those who are listening or viewing, if you would like to ask a question of your own, I'll ask some, but we're going to save time for Q&A, and I'm going to try to work audience questions in throughout the conversation. Just type them into the Q&A format, and we'll have them here, and the team will send them my way. So that's how to ask a question. Now I'll ask my second question, which I guess is just for an elaboration of some of the points we've already heard. It sounds like what most immediately awaits the Biden administration in the eyes of our speakers so far is looking back at the Trump administration and redoing or undoing some of the things that they've done. Now, needless to say, those who follow the Gray Center's work probably know that I'm more favorably disposed towards some of the Trump administration's reforms than some of the criticism we've heard so far. But I'm very curious to hear the speakers unpack some of these things. Why don't we start with Stuart? Stuart, you brought up some of the things that you think, well, actually your phrase was restoring faith in OIRA and White House regulatory oversight. What's that going to take? What's restoring faith going to entail?
So the phrase most often used in describing the Trump administration has been not normal. And the question of sort of what's not normal and what's normal in the regulatory sphere over the past 4 years. And in the not normal category, I would put the things I already mentioned, the quality of the RIAs, and the new initiatives that sort of put the benefit cost framework in general in question. I'd also put the really poor record in judicial review that largely rests on the Trump administration's very weak following of the procedural requirements, not just cost benefit analysis, but also the Administrative Procedure Act. And also the pace of new rules. There's a lot of exaggeration about the Trump regulatory record, but one thing they can say is that they issued fewer significant new rules over the past several years, and that was definitely something that was a departure from previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican. In terms of what was normal, the OIRA expansion of their powers that didn't get much attention, but the memorandum of agreement with the Internal Revenue Service on regulatory review, I think that likely stays in place and will continue. I think we'll probably also talk about independent agencies, which was not a formal change in this administration, but maybe some of the groundwork was laid for that. Within the agencies, reduced enforcement of regulation is fairly normal in a Republican administration, and also the the lack of deregulation despite the rhetoric. But cutting through this normal and not normal, what was sort of significant, I think I'd point to two things. The first is the collective impact of these changes and the rhetoric surrounding them, which was to make sort of regulation much more performative over the last 4 years rather than substantive. The actual policy changes that will last from the past 4 years, I think, are fairly limited, assuming that the Biden administration successfully reverses the ones that the courts and Congress do not reverse on their own. But the perceived policy changes are huge. People really do think that the Trump administration eliminated a lot of regulations, and they really think that the economy, even as early before these so-called repeals took effect, the economy thriving was a result of these repeals. And there's very little evidence for either of these assertions. The second significant impact of the last 4 years, though, I think is substantively real, and that is the reshaping of both the judicial and the executive branches. I'll defer to the lawyers on the panel to talk about the impact of Trump's appointees to the courts. But I'd also highlight the hollowing out of the capacity in the executive branch, the demoralization of people that work there. And so I think a big question for the Biden administration is, how does it get everything it wants to get done, including reversing the Trump actions, restaffing and remotivating the agencies, and the many new initiatives that the Biden campaign touted in the regulatory arena.
Thanks, Stuart. Mike, I alluded to your book a couple times. You dedicate a lot of attention in that book to criticisms of the way the Trump administration carried out regulatory review. Again, we talked about that on the podcast. Why don't you maybe summarize some of that and add any other thoughts you might have for our audience in terms of things that the Trump administration did that you expect the Biden administration to need to take a look at?
Great. Yeah, and I think again, I kind of would bucket these under two general categories. So one is like formal things the Trump administration did overtly, where like the 2-for-1 executive order, or the EPA's recent rulemakings on cost-benefit analysis and on scientific transparency, the so-called transparency rule, where the administration kind of took these overt steps that either de-emphasized cost-benefit analysis or in some other way undermined the general thrust of the last, the prior 40 years, several decades of practice of cost-benefit analysis, of being comprehensive and focusing on maximizing well-being for the American people, and so on and so forth. So there are the kind of specific actions that I mentioned, and then as kind of Stuart was alluding to, there's just kind of the general practice of doing cost-benefit analysis in a consistent and legitimate way. So I'll mention some of those examples there because I think those can be illustrative. So one issue that we talk about in the book is the use of co-benefits in cost-benefit analysis. And this gets talked about quite a bit because it's an important issue in cost-benefit analysis, especially in the environmental area. And what the Trump administration did here is it departed from, again, many decades of past practice by administrations of both political parties, which is to engage in a comprehensive assessment of the costs and benefits of regulatory decisions when that's allowed by law. And so instead, so that includes looking at both the direct effects and the indirect effects of regulation. Okay, so a direct effect, let's just, we'll use a concrete example. In an Obama era rulemaking, there was a EPA regulation to reduce emissions of mercury from power plants. The direct effect was reducing the mercury emissions and then the health and environmental consequences of that. But as an indirect effect of that regulation, particulate matter was also reduced, and the mortality risk reductions from particulate matter, better, improved air quality from particulate matter were an indirect benefit of the regulation. And again, it's been established by administrations of both political parties and long practice to account for both indirect and direct costs and benefits. And that language to that effect is included in the A4 circular that I mentioned that was adopted under the George W. Bush administration. And so what do we see under the Trump administration? How did they depart? So several ways. So one is they explicitly rejected the use of co-benefits in valuing of that rule that I just described, the air toxics rule with respect to mercury. And they said, look, the particulate matter benefits are not direct, and therefore we're not going to take this into consideration when determining whether standards are appropriate and necessary. And so that's this huge departure that we really need to take a second and recognize, again, from this very long-standing practice. It also departs from rationality because one would want to know about the effects of one's regulatory choices. That's the whole idea of cost-benefit analysis, whether they're direct or indirect. But it gets worse because in other rulemakings, the administration took indirect benefits into consideration when it pointed in that administration's favorite direction, which was deregulation. So again, very briefly, this was done. One example is in the car rule, which had to do with automobile efficiency standards. So in that rule, it was an Obama, again, undoing, or somewhat rescinding, rolling back to a degree, an Obama administration regulation that improved fuel economy standards and reduced greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles. And in the Trump effort to roll those standards back, one of the major benefits, the purported benefits of the Trump rollback, was that there would be improved safety on the highways. There would be fewer accidents because cars would be bigger, and there would be less and there would be arguably fewer miles driven. There was a lot of bad assumptions of how they got to the conclusion that there would even be these reduced fatalities. But even accepting that part of their analysis, which was actually quite flawed, the mortality risk reduction would be a co-benefit of the rollback. Okay, so what we get to is in the car context where co-benefits favor deregulation, the Trump administration is happy to embrace them. And then in this other rulemaking where co-benefits favored stronger regulation, the administration just, passed them over. And so this is just one example of actually a litany of other examples where just the basic P's and Q's of how you do cost-benefit analysis according to just regular mainstream economics that administrations and economists and just policy analysts of both political parties would agree to, was rejected by this administration and done in a very inconsistent way that was very clearly motivated with respect to outcomes rather than methodological rationales. And so that's the kind of thing that this administration, I would hope, will very clearly communicate that that's not the way that they're going to do cost-benefit analysis. There's a new chief in town, and we're going to see a major shift there.
Thanks, Mike. And again, somebody asked in the Q&A, and the title of your new book is Reviving Rationality, not to be confused with Retaking Rationality, which is the earlier book. And for those who are asking, yes, this discussion will be available. We're going to post a video, and also the audio will go out in our podcast. Jennifer, any thoughts on things that the Trump administration, some of its reforms that the Biden administration might take a look at?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Stuart and Mike said. I think, first of all, a lot of the signature moves of the Trump administration, I think, are most definitely going to go. So, for example, the 2-for-1 executive order, I think, will be rescinded. Regulatory budgeting, I think, will also likely go by the wayside. Certainly, regulatory reform officers, this is EO 13777, I think, is also likely to go for obvious reasons. It's not regulatory reform Trump style. And I agree with Stuart. I think that the MOA with Treasury is likely to stay. And I think the real question for the Biden administration is this going to be a restoration to a pre-Trump era Obama administration style OIRA? And if so, what is the vision going forward? In other words, it's been well known that Republican administrations, OIRA is usually used as kind of a gatekeeper, a cost controlling mechanism for the administrative state. And it's been said that Democratic administrations have more of this coordination role. And I think really the question is going to be: is the Biden administration kind of a manifestation of that dynamic? Is it going to be coordination? Is it going to be agenda pushing? In ways that we might discuss, whether it's through prompt letters and really trying to move the ball forward, again, because of all of the circumstances that are happening now. Indeed, Biden wants to build back better, but he wants to do it quickly. And or by contrast, as I think many in the party, and particularly the progressive wing, I think favors, is it going to be a vision of OIRA just getting out of the way? That is to say, letting agencies kind of do the work in the way that they know best, and OIRA is really should not be there to put the brakes on any of that. And perhaps we will see quicker reviews or reviews with a lighter touch. I think that's going to be kind of the headline set of choices facing the Biden administration under OIRA and its version and vision of OIRA, really.
If there's anything anybody else wants to add in sort of the look back part of this conversation, jump in. But let me just focus really quickly on the executive order President Trump signed that contained the regulatory budget component, or what Michael in the book calls cost analysis, and the so-called two out, one in rule. I don't presume, to say the least, the Biden administration is going to keep these, but I think there's a case to be made, at least for the regulatory budget side, to say the least. I think it's a good adjunct to cost benefit analysis, not a replacement for it, but another useful metric, sort of standing apart from traditional cost benefit analysis. And at the very least, I hope the Biden administration, as they come in and issue new sort of executive orders, that they'll at least sort of make an accounting, so to speak, of how things performed under that Trump executive order. And hopefully, if they see anything worth keeping, keep it. Anyone want to disabuse me of that notion? Mike, or Jennifer, are we about to say something? Okay, Mike, you want to jump in?
Sure. So, well, in the past, most administrations have built on the work of prior administrations with respect to cost benefit analysis and regulatory review. That is the story that we see up until the Trump administration. So in some ways, if the Trump administration wasn't so strange and wasn't so abnormal, if we had a more standard Republican administration, or one that stayed within the bounds, then I think we would expect to see the Biden administration maintaining more continuity with what we've seen what we saw under the prior administration. And I think it is a testament to the degree to which the Trump administration departed from the general path that we've seen over the last 40 years, that the degree to which the Biden administration is going to reverse course on these things. So with respect to the 2-for-1 and the budget, so I just think 2-for-1 is just bean counting, doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't tell us about the size of the regulation. It doesn't tell us about the costs and benefits of the regulation. It's just like the number of regulations, which I think is not a metric that has any value. With respect to a budget, so I think there are actually major advantages to cost benefit analysis over a regulatory budget, which is why Reagan adopted cost benefit analysis instead of a regulatory budget, which was proposed at the time by folks like Chris DeMuth back in the 70s. And there's a reason that cost benefit analysis was used. That you need a lot less information. Actually, it's a much more straightforward planning tool than a regulatory budget. Now, that being said, there is a mechanism which has been used quite robustly over the years, fallen somewhat out of favor under the Trump administration again, which is an annual report to Congress about the costs and benefits of federal regulation. And that is, I think, probably the thing that's closest to a regulatory budget that makes sense. The OIRA, OMB, goes to Congress and says, these are the costs of the rules that we've implemented. These are the benefits. Take a look. Here's our priorities. And here's what we're thinking about, making changes and so on and so forth. And that's actually a document that's probably, it's akin to a regulatory budget in certain respects. It takes some of the good parts of that without some of the downsides.
Stuart, did you have anything you wanted to add on this?
Yeah, a couple things. I'm glad Mike mentioned the annual reports. I was going to do that. I think there was only one day in the Trump administration which annual reports actually came out. They released 3 of them in the middle of Christmas vacation last year. And the numbers were not even in the report. You had to go to a separate spreadsheet to try and figure out exactly what the costs and benefits of their regulations were. I suspect that's because the reports generally show that even under the Trump administration, they issued a number of regulations and the benefits outweighed the costs. But whatever the reasoning, you have to be someone who is sufficiently obsessed with these numbers like I am to try and go and find them. And I'm really hoping that we get a return to annual reports that actually are clear about the results of agency regulations. I'll make one more point, building on what Jennifer said earlier, that the Biden administration has a choice. And if they go in the direction of OIRA as merely sort of facilitator and just get regs through and help them, then I think they will clearly get rid of a regulatory budget, and it doesn't really have a place in a function like that. If, as I suspect, they try to return to the Obama model of OIRA, mixing a coordinated function with some of the traditional regulatory review functions, they're going to be disappointed progressives out there. And one way you mollify disappointed progressives are to get rid of things like 2-for-1 in the regulatory budget. So yeah, Adam, I don't think the regulatory budget, just because of the politics of it, has much of a future. Now, I'm not much of a fan of it either, but even putting that aside, politically, I do not see how they keep the regulatory budget.
And I just want to emphasize just one theme, because I too was going to mention the annual report, which is just to point out the vast difference between an annual report that kind of ex post reports on, the costs and benefits of regulations that have already been implemented versus kind of an ex ante regulatory budget that, constrains the agencies ex ante about, exactly, what costs it can impose. And the theme I want to emphasize is that we are in such a period of uncertainty. I mean, because of the pandemic, because of all the financial consequences of it, that I think it's going to be even harder for the Biden administration ex ante to be able to say, hey, agencies, here are the, the X number of costs or the budget that we're going to allow you to have when you undertake and think about regulations.
Jennifer, maybe we'll stick with you for the next question now. Looking forward at how the Biden administration might sort of structure OIRA or what it might do to implement some of the tools that we've discussed so far. You've been writing about this for years, the relationship between the White House and OIRA and the agencies, and sort of the practical realities of regulatory oversight. So looking forward, how might you suggest the Biden administration, let me try this again, what reforms or suggestions might you have for just the basic structure and operation of OIRA from the White House?
Yeah, so I take part of your question to sort of be alluding to the intra-executive branch process. That is, how does OIRA actually work with the White House and the different agencies as it coordinates its review? And I think first it's worth observing that just every administration has to restructure this relationship, because often new administrations create new entities, within the executive office of the president. So we've already heard, for example, how Biden is going to be creating, for example, this Office of Domestic Climate Policy headed by Gina McCarthy. There's just going to be new entities that are involved that are going to have to be brought in to the coordination process. And I think that, my previous point about the transition kind of related lack of Senate confirmed political appointees is going to make this question kind of difficult, especially in the next 6 months or so until we get a Senate confirmed administrator, about exactly who gets to be at the table, right, and at what level of the agency are actings going to be have the authority to kind of make these decisions and to resolve any conflicts that might arise between the agencies. So again, the first point is just that there's going to be a necessary restructuring because there are new entities. There's going to be a lot of kind of uncertainties related to the lack of Senate confirmation and the transition related standing up, if you will, of the Biden administration. And then finally, I think there are also going to be questions about how much disclosure to make about this process. So I think there's been a lot of talk and debate for years now about finally having the executive branch follow Section 6 of EO 12866, which, calls for, after the OIRA process to conclude, the disclosure, right? The publication of all the documents that were exchanged between the agencies and OIRA. And that has never really been enforced. There have been leaks here and there, and there's been calls by many outside of OIRA to finally have that be enforced. And I think the Biden administration may want to consider having more of that transparently, to Stuart's point about restoring the legitimacy of OIRA, to show that what often goes on is not nefarious, but rather genuinely a lot of the kind of the information aggregation function that Cass Sunstein has written about. I think that there is some of that disclosure would actually help OIRA, not necessarily hurt it.
Thanks, Jennifer. Maybe just one more point. In our conversations ahead of time, you alluded to OIRA's relationship to some of the other parts within the White House, some of the coordinating councils. There's the familiar Domestic Policy Council, National Economic Council, and if I read the news correctly, President Biden isn't going to institute a climate council, but he has brought back the position of White House climate coordinator, both for domestic policy and then former Secretary Kerry in foreign policy. So how do you think OIRA ought to interact with those parts of the White House?
I think they'll be critical. So as I already alluded to, the climate change czars and the policy offices, I think that they will be a central part of the process. The Obama administration, the implementation of the ACA, a lot of the health czars were very important. I think similarly, because climate change is such a priority of the Biden administration, I think Gina McCarthy will have a very central role and should arguably, given that, climate change related regulations are cross-cutting across agencies. And so I do think they will and should play an important role.
Thanks. Maybe we'll turn to Mike next. Mike, any thoughts on just the basic role of OIRA, how it could be restructured or reformed? We've already touched on this a little bit. I noticed in the chat, Richard Pierce asks why we should assume that benefit cost analysis will be kept at all, given the criticism it's taken from progressives over the years. And as you point out in your book, it has critics on the right as well. Also in the chat, Kristen Hickman asks whether we should have any confidence that, or why we should have any confidence that the Biden administration will keep the IRS sort of under the umbrella of OIRA with the new memorandum of understanding. So Mike, do you have anything for that? And maybe we'll turn to Stuart next on the same question.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would bet that we're going to see continuity with pre-Trump administrations and the Biden administration with respect to benefit cost analysis. It's absolutely true that there have been consistent progressive critics of cost benefit analysis since 1981. And that is carried through, and that carries through now. And there are folks within the Democratic coalition who have called for and will call for eliminating OIRA or severely reducing its role or getting rid of cost benefit analysis, replacing it with some other technique. That's happened, is happening, and will happen. My sense, and I don't have any inside information on this, but I suspect that the Biden administration, like prior Democratic administrations, will resist those efforts and will maintain a robust practice of cost benefit analysis. I just think there are, and definitely OIRA review. There are very, very good structural reasons why presidents want a review office. And then the methodology of cost benefit analysis, ejecting that from the process of regulatory review, I think would be normatively problematic, but would just be politically foolish, given that it would just open the administration up to claims that it was engaged in regulatory zealotry and all the kind of standard critiques that are raised against Democratic administrations. And so cost benefit analysis serves as an enormously important response to those types of critiques where the Biden administration will be able to, if it maintains this practice, go and have a response. If there's some claim in Congress or in the public discourse that they're engaged in irrational and ridiculous regulatory zealotry, they can respond. Actually, the rules that we've adopted have very substantial net benefits. We've conducted the analysis. We've used the best science and the best economics. And so I think that it's very likely that they're going to maintain consistency with prior administrations in that respect. I'll leave it for the other folks about the IRS MOU. I'll stop there.
Mike, before we turn to Stuart, did you have any thoughts on just the basic structure of OIRA? Anything you might do there?
My guess is that again, this is just speculation. My speculation would be that it would remain largely the same. There's always some question about how OIRA fits in with the other White House offices. But I think 12866 is going to stick around. The basic process of agencies being the initiators of rulemakings and then going to OIRA for review will probably stick around. I don't see a big resurgence of things like prompt letters, especially given these other White House offices. They'll be prompting the agencies plenty, I think. So it's not clear that OIRA is going to have an additional role there. And I think and much will turn on who the administrator is, for sure. That's always very important. And so having a qualified person who carries some weight within the administration is going to be important.
And Stuart?
So yeah, my instincts largely agree with what Mike just said. Sally Katzen, I think, said that if there was no OIRA, each administration would have to invent it on its own. And the executive review function, as long as presidents are going to get blame or get credit for regulatory activities, they're going to want a ability to review what the agencies are doing. And so I do think that that function will certainly remain. And my instinct's the same as Mike's. I do think benefit cost analysis will remain as well for many of the reasons that he articulated. The ability to be able to make the argument that the administration has improved the economy by regulating, improved social welfare by issuing welfare improving regulations. Whether or not that's true, and there's obviously a lot packed in there, but benefit cost analysis has consistently been used by the Clinton and Obama administrations toward that end. And I think the Biden administration, which has largely started with a raft of appointees that have experience in the two previous Democratic administrations, are likely to sort of stay on the path that those two administrations did where possible. I also agree with Jennifer on the importance of the other the White House counsels. When I was a desk officer in the Clinton administration, one of the things you had to learn right away was who in the various White House agencies you needed to run things by. If you have a regulation under the new TANF statute at the time, there were people at the Domestic Policy Council that cared a lot about that. If you were doing something in healthcare, there were other people that you needed. I suspect, and particularly as it pertains to climate, that will be true in the incoming administration.
Now in the Q&A, Professor Jeff Lovers has a couple questions about the OIRA's role both as a coordinator and also as an initiator. He alludes to the prompt letters, which is something that came up in our chat beforehand. I don't know if anybody has any further thoughts on this, on whether the Biden administration will or should rely more heavily on prompt letters and what could be done to improve the coordination aspect of things. Jennifer, you've already touched on this some, but do you have anything further to add, especially on the prompt letters?
Yeah, so I do think that there is a kind of a sub-question here about the extent to which prompt letters refer to the public document that is presented as a public indication that OIRA has prompted something versus internally, when OIRA is prompting agencies to do things all the time. I think if we're referring to the public document, if you will, I think, you can observe that was really used in a Republican administration. It was under John Graham that those were used. And I think the public function of that was to signal to the legitimacy point that OIRA was not just a gatekeeper, that OIRA, is also, fighting the good fight and trying to serve this coordination function as well. And so, in other words, even if we don't see public prompt letters under the Biden administration, I don't think that means that OIRA is not prompting or should not be prompting. And I think maybe to Michael's point a little bit, I do think that there is a separate role for OIRA and prompt letters apart from the councils because of OIRA's unique vantage point in seeing the different regulations come from the different agencies. I mean, the council kind of has that, but its access points, because of the lack of this process, I think are much fewer. And so as a result, I think particularly with climate, OIRA is going to be able to see the potential or the opportunities for coordination that counsel for doing something at a particular time, and then there will be these informal mechanisms of prompting. And the reason that we might see those informal mechanisms of prompting become public might again be because of a perception that the reputation of OIRA is not matching the reality and needs to be corrected.
Great. Can I just add one more quick thing to that, Adam?
Sure, please.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting point that Jennifer makes about the informal kind of routes of coordination and informal prompting as well. And I think this is something that will be a big difference in the Biden administration versus the Trump administration, and just kind of worth emphasizing or raising is I think folks in the White House and the political appointees at agencies are going to largely agree about a lot of things. And so they're going to be able to work with each other in a friendly and professional manner to kind of move forward the administration's agenda. And a lot of that will be informal. Some of it will go through formal channels, but that will be a big change and just will be enormously useful and enormously beneficial for this administration to be able to do things. I think that's actually an underappreciated, we tend to focus, we're lawyers, we focus on the formal mechanisms, but just the kind of culture of collaboration and being on the same page is enormously important. And I suspect that's one that will be cultivated from the top down. Of course, we'll have to see. But I think that especially with Biden's experience in the prior administration, and as Stuart said, a lot of folks have experience working with each other in prior administrations, that's going to really redound to the benefit of the efficacy of this administration.
In addition to prompt letters and things like that, one thing I've paid attention to over the last few years has been the use of executive orders on substance, right? President Obama had some of this. President Trump had a lot of this, especially early on in his administration, issuing executive orders aimed at subgroups of agencies, departments, gathered around a specific subject, whether it's financial regulation. There was the core principles on financial regulation. There was the executive order on energy independence and so on, where the president would sort of announce policy direction for the agency. And in some ways, I mean, very clearly, a replacement for the behind the scenes discussions that might have happened. The President Trump just said publicly, here's what I want you to do to the maximum extent possible under existing law. There's something to be, obviously President Trump's relationship to the bureaucracy was different, to say the least. But there's something to be said for any president to sort of make these judgments public and really, show that the buck stops with him. I mean, I grant Mike's point that it's good to have behind the scenes collaboration, but Mike, isn't there something sort of extra value in the president and the White House saying these things publicly?
I don't think there's any question that it's important for an administration to announce publicly its policy goals. I think the best time to do that is prior to an election, so that the American public has an opportunity to weigh in on that stuff. But I don't think the earlier administrations were shy about stating clearly what they wanted to accomplish, taking credit, announcing regulations in the Rose Garden, all that kind of thing. So I think the real question here is whether the format of the executive order is the right or best one. I don't know that I have a strong opinion about this. And I don't want to be biased by like an anti-Trump, everything he did was wrong heuristic. So maybe I'll just kind of wait and let that percolate a little bit. But so I don't have a strong prior about that. But I take the general point that it's good for an administration to be clear about its priorities and to make those public and announce it to the world.
And you often refer to a presumption of irregularity. Mike, you might have just a presumption of irregularity. It's rebuttable, though.
Right, it's rebuttable.
Stuart, do you have any thoughts on what we're discussing right now?
Sure, and pick up on what Jennifer said earlier. I was a fan of the prompt letters when John Graham initiated them, and in part for some of the reasons that you've articulated, Adam. That I do think it's not a bad idea to sort of have the administration out there saying what it wants done in regulatory policy. But to pick up on Jennifer's point, I do think there are two other good aspects to prompt letters. One of them is there are things that OIRA is uniquely positioned to sort of weigh in on and provide expertise on and to prompt on. To pick one example that's currently relevant, a prompt letter to reduce burdens in vaccine distribution to HHS would be, I think, a move that is very consistent with what OIRA cares about, and at the same time is probably something that many people there would be widespread agreement on. And so I do think that they have that capacity, and it's a way of putting that capacity to good use toward the second goal, which is I do think that the use of prompt letters would show people that what OIRA cares about is not necessarily eliminating regulations, which is often the stereotype that people have associated with it, but rather sort of maximizing utility and maximizing social welfare. Now, there are all sorts of issues associated with that and questions of how we do that, but the prompt letters, I think, are a tool for sort of reputational improvement as well.
Sure, maybe we'll stick with you for just a moment in the chat function. And just a reminder, everybody, if you'd like to ask a question, put it I said the chat, but I was wrong. The Q&A function of Zoom. Just enter your question there, and I'll get to as many as I can. In the Q&A, Professor Lovers asks whether it's time to increase the $100 million threshold for costs that we use to trigger the main cost-benefit analysis at OIRA. Is it time for President Biden to raise that threshold?
So the $100 million was always an arbitrary number when it was put in place in the first place. There's nothing special about $100 million. That more than that is a big burden, and 101 is a big burden, and 99 is a small one. So I do think, and Michael was talking earlier about Circular A4, and in terms of revisiting where the right number is I think a valuable exercise. I'm not going to endorse a particular number there, but I do think that the principle, and previous administrations have talked about this, I think both the Bush and Obama administrations have talked about the idea that the bigger the burden, the greater the examination should be. And I mean, I think that principle is something that it would be nice to see the Biden administration get behind as well, regardless of where there's a number. And in a sense, a number is just an arbitrary cutoff. And I think more the principle of using greater scrutiny within the executive branch, providing more detailed analysis on the bigger regulations, the regulations with larger both benefits and costs, I think is a principle that that should stick to any revisiting of A4 or the executive orders.
It's the administrative state's version of income tax bracket creep.
That's right.
Mike, Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on the $100 million threshold?
I'm going to mix things up a little bit and actually argue, perhaps contentiously, that I think that the Biden administration should not waste any political capital on revisiting that right now. I think the reason why previous administrations haven't revisited it, despite being completely irrational, it should be updated for inflation at the very least, right? The reason that they haven't done that is because, it's going to take a lot of resources to try to get some kind of agreement to revise an executive order. And look, the Biden administration has a lot to do, okay? And, I don't think that revising the $100 million standard is really a valuable use of their resources. And then more importantly, I think if the part of the point of revising it is to expand or contract the scope of the review, that is to say, to either sweep in some significant or particular regulations and subject them to greater scrutiny, I can just say that number is very malleable, by which I mean, how it's calculated, what is $100 million of impact and what's not. I mean, these significance determinations, there's a lot of, push and pull there that I think, in practice, if OIRA wants to review something, it can probably make some argument that it fits the threshold such that it's not worth spending time or energy and actually revisiting the thing that's on paper.
Mike?
It's funny, I want to agree with both of my co-panelists. So it's probably true that on the list of priorities, this is just not very high. And the general principle of proportional analysis is one that, one would hope most reasonable people would be able to get behind. And so, whether that's, done kind of somewhat informally or, maybe, 7 years from now, we'll see some updating to some of this stuff, but it's probably not going to be top of the list.
Now, in the Q&A, far and away, the most popular question is what's going to happen with independent agencies. And this is obviously a perennial subject dating back to all the way back to 1981, when President Reagan and his team first put out the original executive order on this. The Gray Center's namesake, C. Boyden Gray, who was deeply involved in that process, he was describing what the Reagan administration had done. And he was asked about the independent agency issue. And his answer was, well, we've already sort of bitten off a lot to chew on with just the executive agencies. The independent agencies are a less pressing matter. They don't do as much, and we just want to focus on the executive agencies. Well, 40 years later, the independent agencies are doing a lot, and there's been calls to bring them into the OIRA umbrella one way or another. We saw just a few weeks ago, before New Year's Eve, the Justice Department released an executive order OLC, a Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel memo that actually had been prepared in October of 2019 on the president's assertion of power over independent regulatory agencies. And so just in very general terms, what do you think? Should the Biden administration bring independent agencies into OIRA's coverage? Will it? I'll let anybody take that one first.
Yeah, I'll take a first crack. First, I just want to observe that historically speaking, there has been, and you alluded to this, Adam, this increasing slow move to increasing OIRA's influence over independent agencies. For example, off the top of mind, under the Obama administration, Obama issued Executive Order 13579, I believe, that called for retrospective review for independent agencies. And then now you're seeing the OLC memo that you alluded to. And so I think that we're seeing this progression for, finally a little bit more bold action. The point I want to emphasize is I think at this moment, the greater willingness, I think, of independent agencies to welcome more OIRA involvement, not least because of the judicialization of cost-benefit analysis in cases like Business Roundtable. That is to say, I think it partly explains why many of the independent agencies themselves have bolstered their cost-benefit analysis capacity. I look at the SEC, I look at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Ajit Pai has done a lot to have cost-benefit analysis be an important part of the FCC's work. And so as a result, I think there is more, an appetite, I think, for even the independent agencies to kind of go along with more OIRA oversight. The last point I will end on is, I don't know if Jim Tozzi's in this call, but I hear his voice in the back of my head, which is, what about resources? What about resources, right? I mean, OIRA is not going to want to extend this oversight without more staff. And I think, both of these features kind of have to be considered together. That is the increasing desire for political control, but it has to come with some more resources.
Jennifer, do you want to elaborate the point about staffing before I turn to Mike and Stuart? That's been a perennial issue over the last many years. And in the Q&A, Barry Clendon asks, does OIRA have too many staff or too few?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but I don't have no reason to think that they've changed much. Recently the staff is varied from about 40 to 50 people. From its historical high, I think at one point it was about 90 people. So this is to say that, I think some people believe, especially with the PRA obligations, Paperwork Reduction Act obligations that OIRA already has, that in fact, it's not too many staff, that there should be more staff devoted to both the PRA function and regulatory review. People are frustrated with the long delays for the federal collection of information because of the PRA process. And I think that point cannot be overemphasized, how important that part of OIRA is. And I think devoting more staff to that would help clear the way, both for federal collection of information, but also regulatory review and all the robust ways that the Biden administration wants to undertake.
Stuart, maybe we'll turn to you next. Any thoughts on both the independent agencies issue and relatedly just OIRA capacity in general?
Yes, I'll start with the capacity issue. As another former OIRA person like Jennifer, I have very similar sympathies and experience there. I mean, with being required to review thousands of information collections each year and a large number of significant regulations each year, the workload is really large, and it just gets bigger. I mean, OIRA keeps getting new responsibilities thrown on it with each administration, or new statutes passed giving them more responsibilities. And certainly the expansion of OIRA can be framed in a way that would help the regulatory process, would help getting regulations out. If you're going to have an OIRA that is going to review significant regulations, then having more people there makes it go faster. Now, maybe you could also couple it with an enforcement of the 90-day limit in the executive order, and something like that. But I do think that there is, and I think there's evidence in the literature that sort of the more time regulations spend at OIRA, the more attention they get, the better the analyses come out. And so I do think that there is an argument to be made for more staff there that's not normative in terms of its regulatory implications. In terms of independent agencies, in addition, as Jennifer noted, more staff would, I think, be necessary in that case if you're going to expand OIRA's purview. Reading the tea leaves, it's very hard to say. There do seem to be a lot of signs out there that we're moving towards independent agency regulations being reviewed by OIRA, but the tea leaves have been there for a long time, and it hasn't happened yet. Whether that's something Biden wants to spend political capital on, I'm not sure, at least early in the administration.
Mike?
Yeah, so I agree that skimping on OIRA staff is penny wise and pound foolish. I mean, these are rules that have like collectively billions of dollars worth of economic consequences, and we're slowing them down and underanalyzing them to save like I don't know, a few $1 million in staffing costs. It just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, so I agree on the budget front. With respect to independent agencies, so I think I'm a bad law professor because I am less interested in the kind of the legal niceties of this question, because I think there are some legal niceties, like can the president direct independent agencies the same way that he or she would direct, executive, and does the president have directive power over agencies in general, and that kind, versus supervisory and that kind of stuff. And I think actually the debate about independent agencies largely turns on that kind of thing. So the reason I think that is the executive order 12866 isn't judicially enforceable. The EPA administrator can issue a regulation without going through OIRA, and that regulation, once it's printed in the Federal Register, is just as valid as any other regulation. It doesn't have to go through the OIRA process. There's an internal mechanism, which is if an EPA administrator does that, a president would likely fire that EPA administrator. So that's the enforcement mechanism. And as we know, that enforcement mechanism doesn't really exist with respect to independent agencies. I mean, I guess we could ask, like, would that then constitute like good cause that would allow the president to fire it? Which that sounds a little much to me, to be honest with you. And so what we're really talking about is like kind of norms and customs and practices. And I think that, Jennifer and Stuart are right, is that there's, some evolving kind of motion in this direction. And there's also, as Jennifer pointed out, the courts. The SEC has gotten dinged in the Business Roundtable decision very famously. The back and forth on the open internet, net neutrality rulemakings. At the FCC, there's kind of been a hydraulic pressure towards more economic analysis. So there's various forces on independent agencies that might encourage them to do more cost-benefit analysis. And if they're going to be in that business, sending it over to OIRA to get a second set of eyes is not a bad idea. And so I think that's kind of mostly what's going on, and making OIRA available for that, and encouraging, a president encouraging administration, independent agencies to do that. Even chatting, with potential appointees and the like, ensuring that they're funded, along the lines to do the economic analysis, creating the process for OIRA, just in terms of, there's desk officers that are charged with that kind of thing. So I think that's the main thing. But I always think there's going to be a difference between the executive agencies and independent agencies, just because of the kind of basic nature of how commission decision making works, the bipartisan nature of the independent agencies, and their independent nature, the fact that they're not under the executive in the same way. So I think that that's going to maintain, even if we see more cost-benefit analysis and even some more involvement by OIRA.
On the independent agencies issue, just the fact that these are multi-member commissions, bipartisan, deliberative, that does add an interesting wrinkle to the basic approach of cost-benefit analysis overseen by OIRA. And it'd be interesting to see how that would actually play out in terms of return letters and what would happen if things were sent back to agencies. But I do want to turn to an issue that's been raised a little bit in the discussion, and it's alluded to in the Q&A as well, this question about the interaction between the agencies, the White House, and the courts. It's a little far afield of our original subject, but it's come up enough times that maybe it's not as far afield as I thought. As has been mentioned a few times, the courts have become more and more interested in the mechanics of cost-benefit analysis. There was the Business Roundtable case in the DC Circuit that's been mentioned, Michigan versus EPA from a few years ago, the Justice Scalia opinion for the court that came very close to saying that if the cost of a rule dramatically outweigh the benefits of the rule, that might be per se arbitrary. And at the same time, as Daniel Walters points out in the Q&A, there's going to be real questions about how quickly the Biden administration can just turn around things that the Trump administration did, how quickly it can undo them. And so if any of you have any further thoughts on this relationship between the courts and what the agencies are going to be doing under White House oversight, please go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just start really quickly with that. So I think that this administration is going to be very mindful of its interaction with the courts. And the Trump administration had an atrocious record with the courts for various reasons. I think the Biden administration is almost certainly going to have a better record, but it's because it will be much more mindful of the reality of judicial review. But that means that things are going to go a little slower than they would otherwise go, because you have to go through these, processes appropriately. Doing cost benefit, again, the progressive argument to jettison cost benefit analysis doesnit look great if the result is just a bunch of rules get struck down. And so I think that this administration is, it would just be shocking if they weren't orienting almost all of their thought to the reality that that there's going to be probing judicial review, and it's just not worth doing stuff if it's just going to get knocked down by courts.
I think I'd also add to that one theory or explanation for why the Trump administration did so atrociously with the courts, because there's been a suggestion that it, maybe just wasn't a focus or a priority. But I think a lot of it was a lack of capacity because of the Trump administration, the White House's relationship with career staff, the ones that are, have the expertise to write really solid, high quality cost benefit analyses in the agencies. And I think with the Biden administration's posture to career servants, I expect that to change partly for that result, that I think career staff will be welcomed into the room when these cost benefit analyses are being written. They will not be written by as much by political appointees that have never seen cost benefit analyses before. And I think as a result, for that reason alone, we're going to see much more success with the courts. That isn't, directly a one-to-one function just of the time spent. You're just going to have, better people on it. So I think there's going to be a better record. And the other thing just to note, if it's a normative, you can pitch this as a normative question of, do we want more judicial oversight of cost benefit analysis? And there are certainly different camps on this. I mean, for what it's worth, personally, I think courts should get out of the business of cost benefit analysis for the reasons that I just alluded to. I think judges are generalists. I think they should be highly deferential to the cost benefit analyses that are coming out of agencies, and there should be a light touch. But certainly, again, the tea leaves are suggesting that that role is going to be a little bit more robust. I decry that trend, but I recognize it.
The only thing I'd add is that, and there's a good paper from Bethany Davis Knoll and Ricky Revesz on how the Trump's record in the courts really provides opportunities for the Biden administration. There are a bunch of cases where the Trump administration lost and the Biden administration will have to make decisions on whether to appeal those losses. There is the Trump precedent of asking courts to hold rules in abeyance while they work on replacements. All of those are techniques where I think you'll see the interaction between the legal system and executive branch, and maybe even OIRA will be asked to weigh in on these things in terms of reversing specific regulation. So the fact that the Trump administration did have such a tough time in the courts will provide a lot of opportunities for the Biden administration.
Issue that's come up a little bit just in these last few moments has been the fact that the arrival of the Biden administration means a less adversarial relationship between the political appointees in the White House and the agencies and the career civil servants. I'd suggest that says a lot about the political appointees, but it also says a lot about the civil servants. And we've seen, again, an interesting relationship, to say the least, over the last 4 years. Jennifer, you wrote your paper on civil servant what's it called? Civil service disobedience. Thinking through that relationship. I don't want to dwell on it too much because I do want to turn, before we finish, to the equality issue. But could somebody disabuse me of my worries that there might be this sort of structural adversarial nature between, say, conservative or Republican political appointees and the experts who are doing the cost benefit analyses?
So just to be clear, the question is, what do we expect these new dynamics to be under a Democratic administration?
I'm a little worried. We all sort of take for granted, and maybe rightly so, that the Biden administration will have sort of an easier go of it in its cooperation with civil servants than the Trump administration did. I mean, needless to say, a lot of that was fueled by President Trump himself in ways in which, I've been criticizing for 4 years. But I mean, should we be worried if there is sort of just a natural alignment between the civil service and the political appointees on this issue with one party rather than another?
I see. Now I see the course of your question. I mean, of course, right? I mean, so there's empirical evidence that does suggest indeed that, many career civil servants are left leaning. And we should be concerned if, in fact, the career civil servants are able to push policy in a direction for which they have no political accountability in the way that political appointees do. So normatively, absolutely. That said, I think it is worth noting that there are these very strong norms that used to exist more about, how those in agencies should conduct themselves, that I would like to think serve as some internal constraint. I mean, Stuart would know even better than I. Many of them are trained, right, to appreciate these norms, that they serve the president and they should not act on their personal preferences. But I want to acknowledge that it is a real concern if, in fact, civil servants are acting on these personal preferences and are able to do so. So the hope would be that these norms are restored. I do not think, to be clear, that civil servant disobedience is something that we should celebrate or that we should want. To the contrary, I think we do not want that. The last thing I will just note, however, is that I do not think it is historically a feature of agencies under Republican administrations. I think there are also examples of this kind of resistance, if you will, under Democratic administrations, but usually from different agencies. And I think you're going to see this, especially with the Department of Homeland Security, the right-leaning agencies, if you want to use Clinton Lewis kind of measures for identifying those, right? I mean, these are agencies, in addition to DHS, the security agencies, national security oriented agencies, there are other ones besides those, Commerce Department and so on, but most publicly, I think ICE enforcement officers have been opposed to immigration policies under Democratic administrations, and they've been very vocal about it and not shy. So I just want to complicate the historical record to say that it exists on both sides, but I do not think that it should be. I think it's something that we should decry, and I think that the explanations of why it occurred, namely the hostility of the last administration, outgoing administration, to the career civil servants, explains a lot of it. And hopefully we see the natural dissipation, if you will, of that disobedience in an administration that is not so hostile to career civil servants.
Yeah. I hate to cut the question off, but I do want to make sure we get to one last point that's very, very important. It's in the Q&A, but in our earlier chat, it talked about it too. And it is this question about other considerations beyond cost-benefit analysis and their role in OIRA and White House oversight. In the Q&A, James Goodwin asks, some have advanced the criticism that cost-benefit analysis is a barrier to promoting social justice and equity in regulatory decision-making, which is potentially significant given that Biden has indicated that his administration will give special attention to these considerations. Can cost-benefit analysis be deployed in a manner to promote social justice and equity, and if so, how? Mike, maybe we'll go to you first, and this will be our last round of questions. This is something you touch on at length in your book, and I know it's something you've given a lot of thought to. So maybe we'll start with you. How should the Biden administration approach these other considerations in the context of White House regulatory oversight?
Great. So the basic principle behind cost-benefit analysis is the idea that regulatory decisions or policy decisions generally, the standard we should hold them to is maximizing social well-being in some very broad sense. And there's all kinds of other considerations that you might want to bring to bear, distributional considerations, social justice along many different dimensions, liberty, individual autonomy. And so I think there's kind of like two ways that we can kind of think about this. So one is we can think of some of these let's call them other moral dimensions as side constraints on cost-benefit analysis, so that we maximize social well-being, but subject to like certain liberty constraints, like we don't impose freedom, limits on people's speech or thought, even if it might be justified from a cost-benefit perspective or something like that. So that's kind of one general framework that we can think about this. But another one, and that's interesting from like a philosophical perspective, but I think that the other important factor here to take into consideration is that's super practical, is about agenda setting. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of rules that are cost benefit justified also promote social justice. There's in no way are those two things in some kind of necessary conflict. And so efficiency criteria and other criteria are actually overlap. And that's often, I think, what happens in rational administrations is what they do is they seek out those areas of overlap and they emphasize those. And so, rules to protect the air are justified in cost benefit terms and also on environmental justice terms, also on distributional terms and so on. Rules that reduce regulatory burdens can be very cost benefit justified depending on the context, and they also might enhance liberty. So that tends to be my personal way of kind of thinking about just from a practical perspective, looking for, instead of looking for conflict between different value sets, looking for overlap. And I think that's how you make policy in a pluralistic society. I think that's how you make policy in a, in a party that's quite diverse. And that's, I suspect how they, well, I don't know how this administration would proceed, but that's, I think, how prior administrations have proceeded when they've been successful.
Well, thanks, Mike. And thanks again, Mike, for joining us today. Stuart, any thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, I think one other piece is both the Obama administration and actually to a limited degree, the Bush administration tried to think about adding, requirements for distributional considerations into cost benefit analysis. The Obama administration definitely emphasized it. That said, you saw it in very few RIAs during either administration, and in part because it's hard. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. There's some good papers on it, but they tend to get pretty abstract pretty quickly. And so one thing you might see the Biden administration do if it follows through on this commitment to environmental justice, social justice, is to re-emphasize the role of distributional factors in CBA. And I think that would be a good thing. I'll conclude my comments with, I think that sort of summing up, what you'll see is that the Biden administration will move quickly and get a lot of credit for sort of the big ticket headline items, getting rid of the 2-for-1 order, et cetera. But the real challenge is sort of what's underneath that, all of the work that needs to go into rebuilding a regulatory system in the executive branch and restoring faith in it. And that's going to be a mission that's going to take most of its 4 years.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm glad you're able to join us today. Jennifer, looks like you're going to get the last word. And I noticed in the Q&A, Shep Melnick asks if people have predictions on who the next OIRA administrator will be. I didn't pose that question. If you all want to blurt out your guess, go ahead. But I assume you don't. Jennifer, why don't you have the last word on this issue and anything else you'd like to?
Yeah, not going to take that bait, but I will just say this, which is, I think Mike and his work with co-authors has been so persuasive to show there is no necessary conflict between social justice concerns and cost benefit analysis. But I want to recognize as a descriptive positive matter that indeed cost benefit analysis has historically sometimes been used as a bludgeon or as an argument, a counter argument to those that do invoke social justice concerns. And I think it's important to recognize that. And I'll just end by saying that I think that the concept of cost benefit analysis is so malleable. And I think it really depends on this question of what does it entail? Does it include distributional weights, as Stuart said? Does it include unquantified benefits and qualitative benefits, expressive benefits, and so on, all the different other features that we could associate with cost benefit analysis. And also, what is the role of cost benefit analysis? Is it just an information forcing function, as some people have written, just to get kind of, pros and cons out on the table in a systematic way? Or is it more of a decision rule? And the more it's a decision rule and costs are really prioritized, then I think it does have the function that the questioner or the commenter has raised. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can just be a way to put information on the table. I will end by saying that I think a lot of the role of cost benefit analysis should be linked back to the earlier point about participation. Okay, because I think a lot of information about distributional impacts can perhaps be come into the administrative state, the more we can get other groups in the notice and comment process and in other features of actually being able to have their voices be heard.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. Before we go, just a brief word about this webinar series. As I mentioned at the outset, this is the first in a series of discussions we'll be having in the weeks ahead about the future of regulatory policy and law under the Biden administration. We're calling it the Administrative State in Transition, and you'll find updates about future webinars on our website and in our email list. All this episode and future episodes, the recordings we've posted online in video. We'll also send out the audio recordings in our podcast, which we recently retitled in light of the name of the center. We renamed the podcast Gray Matters. And so feel free to look up the recordings there. As it happens, our next webinar will be in just 2 days. This week on Thursday, I'll discuss energy and environmental policy with Professor Jonathan Adler, Professor Lisa Heinzerling, and the American Clean Power Association's General Counsel, Jean Grace. That's going to be on Thursday at 1 o'clock. And for the weeks following the inauguration, we'll be planning webinars on several more issues, beginning February 11th, when we'll be talking about tech policy. And given so much focus in today's discussion on the role of the president in regulatory oversight, it's just worth pointing out that this is the 20th anniversary of Elena Kagan's seminal article on presidential administration. That's a subject for which the Gray Center will be doing a conference in fall. And so I hope you'll join us for our upcoming webinars. And on behalf of the Gray Center and the Scalia Law School, thanks for joining us today.